All right. Okay, well, now we're more than halfway done with the overview, and we're going to be looking at Qing China next. This is pre-1750. So some of the things that made the Qing so incredibly powerful in China was first their extreme control of trade relations. They limited Europeans to ports like Guangzhou, and they also limited the goods that they would trade with Europeans to silver. Europeans would stockpile their goods in these trade cities like Guangzhou in what were called factories. We can kind of think of them as warehouses. Obviously, the Chinese had, there was an extreme desire for Chinese goods. China also had a strong centralized bureaucracy that continued to focus on Confucianism, highly trained mandarins, eunuchs, and general advisors. So it was still bureaucratic and still focused on Confucianism. In addition, there was a lot of unity in Chinese society revolving around Neo-Confucianism, limited spread of Christianity, and a big emphasis on filial piety, which included responding positively to the emperor. China had a lot of external pressures at this time. They were experiencing pressure from several areas, but the one we're going to focus on is trade with Europeans. Like I said, the Europeans were limited to trade in Guangzhou, which the Europeans really disliked. Disliked strongly, let's say. They really hated this, especially as luxury goods. Just like in the Ottoman Empire, you see luxury goods continuing to be really important, and there was actually a higher demand for them, but they still couldn't purchase them easily. So Great Britain found a way around this, and that is through the British East India Company's stranglehold, or sorry, not stranglehold, but growing opium in India. This is the same opium that we talk about with the opioid epidemic today. This is a highly addictive drug, and the British knew this. They had outlawed it in their own country. In fact, it was also outlawed in China. What the Europeans did, or excuse me, what the British did, was they sold this opium for silver after they grew it in these huge industrial factories. So they were growing this, it was like a pharmacological industry for them in India. And although it was illegal in China, there was incredibly poor enforcement of this until the 1830s when they really started to crack down, when the Chinese start to crack down on opium. This also is when the British retaliate. So the British started sending in more and more opium, and they retaliated this time with war. So first, this is the British East India Company, and then they call upon the Crown for their aid. And of course, China has not industrialized at all, and the Europeans, the British in the first case, win. In a huge way. They install disastrous treaties, and I'm just going to write about them over here. These are called unequal treaties, where they have to give huge concessions to Europeans. They had to give things like extraterritoriality, which meant that they were not paying taxes and they didn't have to respond to laws in China. They didn't have to follow them. The British received Hong Kong, and they were doing a lot of trade out of that island. They had to open their doors to other societies as well, and they basically had they had open trade, which the Chinese hated. There were several opium wars, not just one, and in each of them there were further and further concessions, until eventually, like I briefly mentioned, many European had spheres of influence in China. So areas where they were being where they had carved up economic control. So in effect, the Qing were no longer in control of their own economy. This picture depicts a Indian opium factory. The balls are balls of opium, and then the opium would be generally smoked. So they would be formed into these like sticky tar balls, and you can see based on the size of this factory the amount of demand for this substance. And a lot of this was going to China. Here we can see, like I said, the rise in opium sent to China from 1650 to 1880. So this is in one chest equals 140 pounds. And you can see in the 1830s when they started to crack down is when there's this large increase here from 1822 to 1835. But then it does not stop. Oh, it goes off the charts by 1880. And then this is an opium, what they might call like opium dens. Oftentimes they would have a place to lay down because opium makes you very, it can make you very lethargic and basically like out of it, I guess. All right, so imagine Zheng He's style technology versus European steamships, and that is the Opium Wars. These ships allowed Europeans to go in river routes, and that was one thing that the Chinese were not expecting, and that really resulted in a lot of territorial acquisitions. As you can see here, a lot of these spheres of influence extend in, like the British sphere of influence and French sphere of influence and German sphere of influence, etc., etc. So there were also many internal issues that the Qing were dealing with, and the two are related. So we're talking about a government here that was, let's not say like barely functioning, but it was hobbling. And this government, first of all, was very, they buried their heads in the sand. They were not down with attempted reforms to try to make things better. Some people were. It was very conflicted between reformers and those who wanted the old way. So this is famously represented by Dowager Empress Cixi, who was the last empress of China. And she was too proud, too egotistical to recognize the benefits of industrializing. But there were factions within the government that she actually sabotaged who did want to industrialize. Famously, you have the self-strengthening movement, which is a movement from 1860 to 95. And the slogan of this movement was Chinese learning at the base, Western learning for use. So this was all about bringing in shipyards, railroads, education to try to make things better. And then Cixi sabotaged this. She also sabotaged the 100 Days of Reform, which were in 1898, also about industrialization. As a result of this failure, Europeans gained more power, as we saw in the previous slide. And this led to an anti-European rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. where the Boxers, or the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, were actually supported by Tsitsi. They attacked what they called foreign devils by attacking foreign embassies. And this was completely crushed by Europeans. Believe it or not, that was not the only rebellion that resulted from ineffective and corrupt governance. There were many, many rebellions in the 1800s in China. From 1800 to 1900, the population in China increased 50%, but the food production remained the same, which meant that you had a lot of hungry peasants who were fed up with their corrupt government. So they had a large population increase, no more food. The Taiping Rebellion is the culmination of this. It's led by Hong Zhuquan, who called for many reforms and a takedown of the Qing. Some of these reforms were the abolishment of private property. Sounds a little communist there. Getting rid of foot binding. No concubines. Encouraging communal wealth. And this guy was a teacher, so he wanted free public education. He also famously thought that he was Jesus' brother. He was a Christian. And this rebellion in the end was, although it lasted for a long time, and it actually controlled a large part of swath of China for a long time, resulted in 20 million deaths at least, and maybe up to 30 million. It is the sixth largest deadly event in history, and leads to the eventual end of the Chinese dynasty in 1911. Okay, this is Empress Tsitsi here, and this is the marble ship that she decided to take the funding for the Navy was all put into building a marble boat that wouldn't go anywhere during the time of the Opium Wars. So this is a decorative ship in the Summer Palace. You can visit it today. Here we have the some images from the Taiping Rebellion. This is the area that they controlled. Oops. This is a depiction of a battle in the Taiping Rebellion. And then the image over here is the British versus the Boxers in the Boxer Rebellion. And here we have the Boxers who are being held captive and who are going to be assassinated and tortured in all sorts of horrific ways. You can see the queue that the Qing forced the Chinese to wear their hairstyle in. You can, if you're interested in that, you can look up Boxer Rebellion. And we're going to end with Tokugawa Japan in the next segment.